Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Mindscape podcast. I'm your host, Sean Carroll. And today we're going to dive once again into the waters of psychology. Our guest is Olga Khazan, who's written a new book called Weird, The Power of Being an Outsider in an Insider World. In other words, we're talking about what it means to be weird. And we're not defining the word weird to mean some weird thing. What we really mean in everyday life when we just say someone is weird. That person's normal. This one over here is a little bit weird. So what do we mean by that? What are the conditions under which we would classify someone as weird? Why do we do that, right? There's a sociology problem, not just a psychology question here. Why do societies choose to label certain people as weird and other people to be normal? The word normal reflects on the fact that we're obeying norms. Every society comes up with, it invents rules that you're supposed to follow. And if you don't follow those rules, or not just rules, but expectations, then you are labeled weird. Now, there's questions for the person who is being weird also, right? Like, there are different ways to be weird. Sometimes it has nothing to do with things you can control, like you're a foreigner in a strange country. Sometimes it might be your personality or your choice of hobbies or work or whatever. There's very clear ways, backed up by psychological studies, that show you how society kind of punishes you for being weird, how it ostracizes you, tries to slow you down. But as Olga argues, there's also benefits to being weird. There's a certain kind of creativity, a kind of new perspective on the world that you can get from standing a little bit outside the norms. So this is a very fun and insightful conversation that probably everyone can relate to, because it's not that people are weird, it's that different parts of every individual person may have some weirdness attached to them. Remember, we have a Patreon that you can support Mindscape with, patreon.com/Sean M. Carroll. And remember also, I'm doing a video series called The Biggest Ideas in the Universe. We tackle a lot of, just very informally, ideas from physics and math and philosophy and so forth that help us understand the universe that we are in. It's a real video, right? It's not just the talky stuff we do here on Mindscape, which is audio only. You can actually see me writing on a little pad, and you can see the little diagrams that I draw, and you can think, boy, that guy's not very good at drawing diagrams. But the ideas are kind of interesting. So with that, let's go. Olga Khazan, welcome to the Mindscape podcast.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me on.
So you've written a book about weirdness, being weird, what it means, what you can do about it. And as someone who's written books myself, I know that this is just asking for trouble, because unlike the Higgs boson or quantum gravity, weirdness is something where everyone in the world is going to have a pre-existing opinion, right? So what induced you to take on this crazy task?
Yeah, so I agree that it could be everything and nothing. So what kind of prompted this is that I had a kind of an unusual upbringing. I grew up as an immigrant, a Russian immigrant in West Texas. And though I'm not currently quote unquote weird. I live in DC, and there's a ton of foreigners and immigrants here. I really, that experience kind of stayed with me, and I became obsessed with this idea of difference and what it means to be different. And I just sort of really wanted to dig into the science behind conformity, nonconformity, why we dislike outsiders, and what it's like to be just completely different from everyone else around you, and how that affects your psyche. So I started reaching out to people who kind of personified that feeling.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's sort of many different dimensions along which one could qualify as weird. Probably everyone thinks that they're a little bit weird, compared to other people. So do you have a special angle on what you mean by weird? How do you define it?
Yeah, totally. So the way that I defined weird for the purposes of this book is someone who is different from everyone else around them in whatever context they're in.
Hmm.
For the most part, this was looking for people, reaching out to people who were, say, like a male in an overwhelmingly female profession, or a female in an overwhelmingly male profession. or like a liberal in an extremely conservative environment, or vice versa. And basically reaching out to them and being like, hey, what's it like to be you? Like, and yeah, so it's not necessarily people who, like, walking down the street, you'd be like, that person, they're weird.
Yeah.
It's people who are, by the definition of what they're doing or where they're living, are different from other people.
I mean, how subjective is it? If one person is weird because, they're the only male in a woman dominated job, for example, if the same person were in a male job, then suddenly they wouldn't be weird, right? So weirdness is sort of a relationship question between a person and their environment. Is that fair to say?
Yes, totally. Yeah. Like, so you're not going to be, yeah, like, weirdness takes other people. Like, so, my favorite example of this is, so being, Olga in West Texas made me super weird, my name in particular. But Olga is actually a really, really common Russian name. So I went to Russia, uh, randomly a few years ago, and I was sitting, um, on a train, and just randomly sitting next to me on this train was another woman with my same exact first and middle name. And in Russia, you use your first and middle name.
Yeah.
Because it's just like super duper common. Like, I have like a very common Russian name, and I don't know, it was just like so disorienting because um, I had always been used to like explaining my name and where I'm from and what I'm doing here and all that stuff. And it was just very like, oh yeah, I'm just another Olga. Like,
Yeah.
here I am. So yeah, so that's what I mean by weird, is like, obviously being an Olga in Russia was not weird.
But it's not only a mismatch between yourself and what the rest of the world expects, is also, different things we can emphasize. Like your name is kind of important, your gender, and your political or religious views in different contexts. Whereas maybe, I don't know, hair color or height are less completely dramatic unless you're super weird in hair color or height. So, I mean, it comes into not just how we're different, but what the rest of the world cares about, right?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it's totally up to how other people perceive you. And it's funny that you mentioned height. So yeah, hair color, like, you could dye your hair.
Yeah.
But if you think about height, so one of the first people that is introduced in the book is a guy who is, of short stature. He's like, what, he has dwarfism.
As
And
soon as I said that, I realized, oh, that was a bad example because that was one of the things you talk about a lot in the book. Actually, sorry about that.
No, it's okay. But like, yeah, but so, and you would think like, oh, that's not a big deal. Whatever. We have like, actors with dwarfism, Peter Dinklage and so forth. But he actually like had a really, really rough time breaking into medicine because of that. Like, there
Yeah.
was a time when you just could not become a doctor if you weren't tall. So I mean, that just gives you a sense of like, yeah, this stuff definitely still matters.
Well, and the world, we take the world for granted in various ways, the world of human interaction and employment and so forth. But the world is made for non-weird people. Like if you're a doctor that is too short to reach the operating table, there's nothing about the height of the operating table that is set by the laws of nature, but it makes your life hard.
Yeah, totally. Well, and it's that story in particular was so strange to me because, like, the stuff that was told to this guy, Michael Ain, it was like, oh, people want. It was all about. It wasn't even. So he stands on a step stool to reach the operating table. It's not like, like an incredible accommodation that he needs. Like,
Yeah.
he just stands on a stool. But the thing that people would always like, the people rejecting him from medical school were always telling him was like, people want doctors in long white coats. They want like authoritative looking
Mm.
doctors who they can trust. And like, a short man is just not authoritative. And it's like so incredible that it's not even like that they were worried that he couldn't, hold a scalpel or whatever. They were just worried that doctors, or that patients wouldn't take him seriously because he wasn't like what like you imagine a doctor in your mind to be like.
Yeah, and I always in these interviews like try to play the devil's advocate a little bit, even when I'm on the other person's side. So I don't agree with this at all. But isn't there a argument to be made for that perspective? I mean, part of the doctor's job is to be a reassuring authority figure. Like, is being tall and dignified looking arguably part of the job? Is your weirdness truly a hindrance there?
Yeah, so that's definitely like, I mean, you see that argument a lot in workplaces, right? Like, whenever we go on a job interview, what are people looking for? Is a cultural fit. And that
Hmm.
basically means someone who talks the way everyone who already works at the company talks and acts the way everyone who already works at the company acts. And it often excludes people who are either neuroatypical or who are just atypical or who don't already have that like inside speak kind of hookup that the company is looking for. So yeah, of course, like this is like the big problem of the book is that we like people to be uh normal. we
Yeah.
we like normalcy. Like humans are a normal creature. We form tribes. We like other people who look like us, act like us. We like the rule followers, and when things don't follow the rules, it's unnerving and disconcerting to us. And so I'm writing about what it's like for those people who break the rules and why we should maybe rethink the fact that we like everything to be normal.
But it's also true that things are complicated, right? I mean, that's another lesson of your book is that the whole thing is very complicated. And when we look at stories in novels or movies or whatever, it's the weird little underdog that we're rooting for, right? It's not the perfect fit in person that we're rooting for. I think that we all probably like to think that we are pro weird, but maybe we exaggerate the extent to which that's operationally actually the case.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I think that you're totally right. I think most people would say like, "Of course, I'm open to whatever. I don't need normalcy in my life." But then if you think about your real, like your revealed preferences are for
Yeah.
normalcy, right? Like, I don't know. Like I think you're correct that we all like to think that we root for the underdog, but that we don't actually. And I think a big part of those underdog stories is the way that the story is told, is that it puts the underdog at the center. It makes him the protagonist and tries
Yeah.
to establish a bunch of commonalities between the underdog and the viewer. But if you look at something like, Anna Karenina, like she was an underdog who killed herself because she didn't fit in.
Yeah.
So like it's not every underdog story that has a happy ending.
That is that is true. Let me pause for a second to talk about the Peloton digital app. You're probably familiar with Peloton in terms of the bicycle that you can own at home and get workouts on, but even without any equipment, you can get a good workout just using Peloton's app. You can go for an outdoor run, take a bodyweight strength class, or just get a breather by meditating in front of the TV with your family. It's an incredibly convenient set of classes that give you a workout at home with any equipment or none at all in a wide range of disciplines. With the Peloton digital app, you can access all of Peloton's content, a full library including strength, meditation, running, and more. And you can access from many devices, your phone, your tablet, your smart TV, or your computer, whatever is easiest for you. And now you get a 30-day free trial, which gives you the ample opportunity to explore everything Peloton has to offer to start a new way of working out. So to learn more and start your free Peloton trial, go to onepeloton.com/app. That's ONEPELOTON.com/app. Download the Peloton app and start moving today. One of the things you do in the book is you do go into the details of some of the psychology studies that have been done about these issues and so forth. And one of the things that hit home very powerfully is how much the idea of weirdness is set by social norms. So it's not just that it's the weird person in the outside world, but the outside world is a community of people working together to invent these ideas of what counts as normal and what counts as weird. Maybe you want to say something about that, or we can skip right to the example of clothes and bathing suits and nudity and so forth.
Oh yeah. Well, so yeah, okay. So I can talk more broadly about this, and then I can end on bathing suits. If
Yeah.
how's that? So yeah. So kind of what we think of as normal is determined by this concept in sociology called tightness and looseness. And basically, if you think about I don't know how many people have seen that new Netflix show Unorthodox. about the Hasidic Jews, that's like a very tight culture. It has a ton of rules. There's rules for how you dress. There's rules for how you behave. There's rules for how you get married. There's rules for how you dance at the wedding. Like everything is very tightly determined by rules. And those societies have established those rules because they're very worried about extinction. They're like very concerned about perpetuating their society. Everyone has to work together in this very tight way in order to keep it going. Now, on the opposite end, you have Burning Man, right? You have a totally loose society. It has no rules. Everyone bring whatever art project you want. You can do drugs. You can be naked. You can like whatever, roll around on a four-wheeler. Like it's completely anything goes. These are very loose societies that don't usually these societies, you don't see them as obsessed with like perpetuating themselves. So like Burning Man is literally like time delimited. Like at a certain point, they just go home.
Yeah.
But also like if you look at like a real example, the Unitarian Universalists are a really good example of this. They have their adherence rate is basically stagnant. They've not really grown at all in over the course of like more than a century. And part of that is that it's not a very rule-based religion. My boyfriend's a Unitarian Universalist, and you don't really have to do anything in that religion. You don't have to go to church. You don't have to like pray to God. There's no like set things that you really do. And so people just like don't do it. And it's kind of like petered out. So the part of the book where I write about bathing suits is just like an illustration of like how bizarre the norms of society can be, where like, if you go to the pool or the pool of my apartment building is like 2 feet from the like street where like people are wearing clothes that cover their butts. Yep. And like, but like everyone at my pool of my apartment that is 2 feet away is like showing off their ass and like, and like their cleavage and like, is just like completely letting it all hang out because we've decided that that's like appropriate near water.
Because they're near water,
Like, I don't know. So I just thought it was like a very interesting example of like, we have a ton of rules in our society that we follow, even if we don't realize it.
and you mentioned that, bikinis typically don't cover any more than underwear does, but we'd be very embarrassed to be seen in our underwear. And yet the bikini, we actually intentionally go out there.
Right. Yeah, that was maybe, I don't know. I maybe like got a little too high on my own supply in that section because I was like, I'm like so fascinated by the norms of swimming. But like, I mean, like if you think about like anything to do with bathing or nudity or anything like that, that is like a very, that whole space is just filled with norms.
No, I mean, I think it's actually a great example because not only is it filled with norms, but it's the most arbitrary, right? I mean, what you can wear, any slight deviation from the uniform of whatever place you're in really, really gets noticed and in I'm sure all sorts of ways gets enforced.
Yeah, totally. Well, and like another good example of this is like, so most bathing suits, for women, or at least like for most of my childhood and teenage years were 2 pieces. Like that was like the most common. You wore like a little like, bikini bottom and a little top. But for a while, I went to evangelical youth group at a church, and they were going to take us to a water park. But their rule was that you had to wear a one piece so that it would cover your belly button.
Yeah.
And like, I don't know, it was like such an interesting example of like, okay, we're okay with all of this. Like you can show all of this skin, but like the belly button, like please, for God's sake, cover it. Like it's too sexy. Like, you know what I mean? And it's, I sort of get where they're coming from, but it's also, I don't know, to me, like that was such an interesting reminder of like how we try to like kind of create this, create these rules on the fly, and they're sometimes really strange.
The female belly button, at least. I mean, the male belly button apparently has no sexual connotations, I guess.
Yeah, totally. But the female one, yeah.
But this was also, I don't know if you know, but the TV show I Dream of Jeannie had a rule that they were never allowed to show Barbara Eden's navel. That was a no-no. Elaborate costuming went to do that.
But the rest of her outfit is kind of sexy, right? Like,
oh, yeah.
Like Like, I don't think the navel would have. I actually didn't know that, but I don't feel like the navel would have been that memorable.
No, the
But
whole point
anyway,
was that she was supposed to be kind of sexy, and but
yeah.
that was judged to be too far. But I mean, we should mention a little bit more about the tight and loose distinction because I actually had Michelle Gelfand on as a previous guest on the podcast.
Oh yeah.
So the most devoted listeners know all about tight and loose societies, and it's not that one is good and one is bad, right? This is part of Michelle's point. It's not that you should be tight or you should be loose. There's benefits and disadvantages to either. And in either, there's just different standards about the extent to which you better be following these norms.
Yeah, totally. And I'm so glad you brought that up. Yeah. So I should say tightness and looseness is totally Michelle's thing. Like she wrote a whole book about that. And if you're interested in that, you should check it out. And I like just borrowed her brain for this part of the book. But yeah, like, so when it comes to tightness and looseness, like there are advantages to living in a tight culture. Like how nice to know exactly what you're supposed to do
Hmm.
every day and to never have to question whether you're on the right track or whether you're, doing the right thing. Like if you're, going back to the Hasidic example, if you're a Hasidic Jewish woman of my age, I would probably be a stay-at-home mom. I would have like, 6 or 7 kids. I would kind of do the same thing every day. I would cook for my husband. I would like follow all these certain procedures. And like, frankly, some days when I wake up and I'm like, I don't know if I should email my agent or like pitch a story or like, do a bunch of interviews. Like, I have a lot of like existential angst because my life is very freeform.
Yeah.
Like I don't have any expectations on me basically. And like it has costs and benefits. I wouldn't want to be a Hasidic Jewish woman, but I also acknowledge that like part that there's a downside to living a life where there's literally no rule book or template for you to follow.
Well, I think that's exactly right. And I'm probably tending toward loose myself in my preference for where I would want to live, but I really do want to stand up for the positive aspects of a tight society. Like, look, we have modern society, humanity has invented a whole lot of problems that didn't used to exist about anxiety about the world and how to find a job and things like that. And a lot of it is associated with the looseness of our society. And the idea of being in a tight group of people, whether it's small or large, where you know exactly what the rules are, can make your life a lot easier in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's such a good point. I do think that a lot of the angst that I hear, and I used to like, I don't know, I occasionally mentor like younger journalists coming up in the world, and like I just hear this like refrain of like I don't know what to do, like I don't know how to get started, I don't know what I should be focusing on, and it's not like they don't know, they literally want me to tell them. It's almost like they do want me to tell them what to do. Like
Yeah.
it's like, there is so many ways to like make a good life for yourself now these days. And like that's awesome. Like who wouldn't, want that? Like, there are so many paths available, but it's almost like this paralysis of choice of like, well, which one should I do? Which one will make me happiest? Which one is the best? And I think that can be really disorienting.
I remember the first time I shopped for a condo, and I had a wonderful, wonderful real estate agent who showed me all these places, and he was very good at picking out the good aspects of a certain place and noticing the potential pitfalls. And then I would say, "Well, what do you think? Should I get it?" And he's like, "Yeah, no, I'm not going to give you any guidance about that." And it was so frustrating. I wanted to be told because I had never done this before. It's a huge choice.
I know. Yeah. Yeah. We're starting to like think about house buying, and like that's going to be a whole other,
Ah,
yeah, paralysis of choice.
well, and you also. So before I forget, I do want to have one one silly sounding question. You mentioned Burning Man as a loose society, paradigmatically loose, because you can be naked and do drugs and do art, but isn't everyone at Burning Man naked and doing drugs and doing art? Like if I walked around Burning Man in a three-piece suit, wouldn't people look at me like I was weird?
Right. 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 Like if you really want to do a crazy art project at Burning Man, do you just like wear a t-shirt and jeans and
Yeah.
like, yeah, I mean, oh, that reminds me of like, do you remember normcore, that
Oh
like
yeah.
style of dress? So it was like
I
this.
like to think that I was before that even became popular, that I was really perfecting that.
I think that's so awesome because it's like people are like, what's the craziest thing I could wear? I know, a sweatshirt and jeans and
Yep.
sneakers. And it's like you've come full circle to like, the crazy is normal anyway. But that's like a good example of what you're saying. And like a few sociologists told me that is like, as people in especially loose cultures look for more and more original things to do or more like weird or crazy ideas, you kind of converge on like the same thing. So you see this with the Apple like revolution where like at
Mm.
first Apple was all about, breaking free and like not being like 1984 and being an innovator, and now it's like who doesn't have a freaking MacBook? And
And
like, which is great, like they're great MacBooks, but like you're not being different by using a
no,
MacBook. You're just
that's right.
you're just like everyone else.
And you dive briefly into the physiology of this. I mean, you talk about how there is a gene that helps control your dopamine receptors, D4. And it's not that it makes you, if I understood what you were saying correctly, it's not that it makes you act one way or the other, but it just affects how much you follow whatever the norms are, whatever the society around you is telling you to do.
Yeah, I mean, I still think that most of this, like most of what determines whether you're like a norm breaker or not is going to be like based on how you're raised and like your own personal kind of biology and your, childhood home and like also where you grow up. But there is sort of this early research that suggests that um, like how much we uphold norms is related to the variation we have on one gene called the dopamine D4 receptor gene, and it basically just influences how much we endorse the values of our culture. So, like a European American who carried this gene might become more like individualistic and sort of pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, kind of traditionally like American norm.
Hmm.
But like a Asian who carried a variation of this norm might become more interdependent, which is like a more like Asian value of more communitarian. So it doesn't necessarily make you one way or the other. It just kind of makes you uphold whatever the values are of your environment more. But that's just one, obviously, like one study. There are so many. It's not like if you have this gene, you're destined to be a rule follower.
No, no,
Um,
we don't want to be too reductive about the genes. That's definitely a bad thing. But it does
yeah.
point to the fact that weirdness, even though the fact that you're weird is subjective in the sense that it is a relationship between you and the culture around you, whether or not you become weird might have something to do with your genetics, right?
Yeah, totally. I mean, and there's also like, some research that people with like autism or borderline personality disorder actually have a hard time kind of interacting normally with society because they have trouble kind of reading a social situation and like fitting themselves into the norms of that environment. So there are all sorts of other like mental health conditions and kind of personality traits and things like that that can interact with this and influence how willing to be weird you are.
Yeah, and I mean, it is a fascinating thing that there's. So I'm just being very obvious. So let me try to be a little bit more substantive. There's the individual and where they come from, either through nature or nurture, and then there's the society and how it treats weirdness. Right? Like there are reasons from evolution and from biology why a society would want its members to be more or less rule following. Another podcast I did was with Nicholas Christakis, who talked about mild in-group bias as one of the important socialization factors that makes a society work.
Yeah, totally. So this is like an area of debate, I should say. But yeah, so there is this idea that like that some anthropologists have that in our ancestral past, we did have this in group bias, that we had kind of networks of alliances and we kind of, uh, we liked people who were more like us than people who were
Hmm.
different from us. And so, like, I use this example of the Chibi art. It's too complicated to get into here, but essentially, that we sort of had this like little clan that we stuck to, and we liked everyone to act the same way in this clan, and that's sort of how we survived and thrived. Other anthropologists are not so sure about that. So they're by studying like more like modern day hunter gatherers, they've found that our alliances are often a little bit more loosey goosey than that when we're kind of off in our natural state. That we would like kind of travel around and trade with people who live hundreds of miles away.
Hmm.
You might like live with one clan for a while and then switch over to another clan. There's like all these like interesting reports of from the 19th century of like Aborigines in Australia who would find like a beached whale and then like have a big party for all the other Aborigines and be like, come share our whale and like have sex with us. And like,
They knew how to
let's
party
have
back
a
there.
giant like yeah, like let's have a big party. So that doesn't seem like very um you know like stringent or obsessed with like our own group
Right.
or with other people who act like us. So that it's like a little bit unclear. What I will say though is that there's a general agreement that that kind of when society became more xenophobic is right around when farming developed.
Hmm.
Farming kind of settled everyone down. There weren't as many whale parties. There was more like, plowing and tending fields and being more, judicious about your resources and what was yours and what was someone else's. You kind of had the development of social hierarchies. Some people had more, some people had less. The climate changed. You started to get money and religion and things like that. So it's actually interesting that like a warfare has increased since that all started happening. So we think of like farming and like the development of civilization as like being a good thing, but it's actually like we didn't really fight that many wars until we started having property to fight over.
Did you ever think that this is what you would be talking about? If you imagined yourself 10 years ago, you'd be thinking about the origin of farming and what it meant for people getting along with each other.
Yeah, yeah, I don't know. I thought like it was important in this book to like go back and look um at sort of the origins of why we dislike weirdos, since that was sort of one of the questions that I was trying to answer.
Yeah,
I wanted to like explore that.
and it's a pretty dramatic idea that you're exploring here. That because we tend to think that the way that we act in the world and sort of socially get along right now is more or less a law of nature, right? It couldn't have been any other way. But you're suggesting that even the simple fact that we have strong affinities for people in our group and tend to react negatively to people outside our group wasn't necessarily always like that. It could have been different, and there was some transition that was technologically driven 10,000 years ago that might have started it all off.
Yeah, I mean that's the premise that a lot of these anthropologists have, is that essentially when we started kind of protecting our own land and our own property, that is when we started being really wary of other people coming and taking our stuff. Like if you look back at the beached whale example, you're not going to have so many people like flock to your beached whale that it becomes uh, you know um impossible to feed them all, and you have to like drive some of them away. Like it's there's going to be plenty of resources to go
Yeah.
around, and you kind of see that today too, where like in a lot of places, especially in part of the book I write about the Rust Belt towns who attracted a lot of immigrants, and I think that you see some of that scarcity mindset um, in some of those areas where the people there felt like the jobs are drying up, the kind of the composition of the town is changing. I'm seeing a lot more people from Spanish speaking countries, and I'm made really uncomfortable by that. If there was plenty to go around for everyone and everything was like a free flowing never ending supply of whatever everyone wanted, be it jobs or security or you know positive good vibes about the future, I feel like people would be a lot more open to those outsiders.
Well, and it feeds back into the tightness versus looseness distinction, right? When things are going tough, when resources are scarce, societies tend to tighten up.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so that's one of the findings from Michelle Gelfand, is that when you like the kinds of emotions that bring forward a leader like Trump or any of these sort of populist kind of leaders are feelings like I'm not going to have enough for my own kind. I need everything to be super conformist and super homogenous for a while because I um, am really concerned about the future and I'm worried about my own kind getting enough stuff.
Yeah, okay. I mean, so if we take this, a bunch of ideas here about what the idea of weirdness is, where it comes from, why it exists, the other major feature of your book is sort of talking about what is it good for and bad for, right? You know, there are both positive and negative aspects of being weird. I was fascinated by this study that you mentioned, which apparently is famous, though I'd never heard of it, but the psychology department that decided to ostracize one of their members randomly from week to week, and even though they knew it was
Yeah.
happening.
No, totally. Yeah. I don't know if it's that famous. I just like came across it in my research and thought it was a
Okay,
really poignant example.
makes me feel
But
better.
this was this study of yeah. So we think about like so one thing I often hear is like, well, who cares about ostracism, right? Like after high school, no one really cares about who gets invited to the prom or not, and who is left out. But it's actually still plays a really big part in our adult lives. I think people just don't really talk about it that much. These professors decided to each ostracize one in their group um, on a given day. So they would pick a day and be like, this is your day for being ostracized. And so they were all in on it. So you would think that they wouldn't be that upset by the ostracism. Like, so they would like decide not to talk to that professor that day or just to totally ignore them. But even though they knew that it was happening, even though they were all in on it, they actually still were really distressed by what was happening. Like they um, wrote that they felt like a ghost on the floor. They were like really desperate for human interaction. And that just speaks to how troubling ostracism can be for us, even if, we know that it's happening and even if we are aware that it's like just part of an experiment. So think about how distressing it would be if you didn't know why it was happening and it
Yeah.
wasn't part of an experiment.
I mean, maybe this is worth digging into a little bit more. I think probably that psychology study is an especially vivid example, but probably most people are on board with the idea that being ostracized makes you feel bad. How close is the connection with being weird and being ostracized, right? There's sort of different levels of weirdness, I suppose.
Yeah, totally. I mean, so not everyone is going to like, obviously, like some types of difference in our society are more pronounced and more looked down upon than others. So, like, um, you think about like the history of like prejudice, and like obviously that was a lot more extreme than like what the female NASCAR driver that I, followed was experiencing, which is just like some low level sexism occasionally. So there's like differences in degree. So I'm not trying to say like everyone who's different experiences it the exact
Yeah.
same way. But you do find that like the whole reason why people feel ostracized or looked down on or discriminated against is because um, the humans are a group that really values normalcy and consistency and rule following. And when people break those perceived rules, it's really troubling and we find it really distressing. And we tend to kind of push away those people who violate our rules.
I mean, there are layers, I guess, of weirdness. I was trying to think in my mind, you know, being a transgender person is one kind of way you could be weird, which would lead to certain reactions from other people. Being, you know, really into role playing games or something like that is a different way of being weird, or just being super introverted is being weird. Is there are there studies of commonalities in the way that these groups get ostracized and how they cope with them, or is it just you should think of it as a case by case basis?
Yeah, I mean, so there's definitely studies. The studies tend to be of like particular groups of people. So I'm trying to think in my book, it was like there's studies of of like gay and lesbian and bisexual people, for
Hmm.
example. So like there's a study finding that gay, lesbian, and bisexual people who experienced homophobic language get more headaches and chronic diseases and they are in worse overall health. And there's studies of like trans people and how the lack of access to gender affirming bathroom, affects trans people's mental health. So the studies that tend to be done are not like, hey, let's take everyone who's different and like study them.
Yeah.
They tend to be on subgroups of people. But what I'm talking about when I talk about these like broader emotions of like feeling pain or ostracism, I'm talking about clinical studies where they bring in people regardless of who they are and ostracize some of them and make them feel bad. And then you know, uh it's not looking at like, oh, were you a female like engineer before you came into the lab? You know what I mean? Like they aren't necessarily trying to find people who are different to start with.
So the studies artificially ostracize people and then see what the effects are.
Yeah, and like and sometimes the effects are good, right? Like so one of the studies that I talk about in the book is one where they ostracized someone in the group and they found that it actually led them to be more creative.
Hmm.
And like to really boost their creativity. But again, that was like an artificial form of ostracism. Like the people who ran that study brought in the volunteers, and then they were like, "You four are not picked to work with the group. Like you go away." And that actually caused them to be more creative. But it wasn't like they didn't ostracize like the four trans people. They
Yeah.
just ostracized four random people, if that makes sense. So you can artificially create this situation, but if you think about it, like that's the feeling that a lot of people who are visibly different in some way or noticeably different in some way deal with every day.
Well, right. I mean, it brings up the question of what are the coping strategies. I mean, you have a wonderful discussion in your book about there's a coping strategy, which is to sort of find your own people, right? To find people with whom you're not weird. But there's a different
Yeah.
coping strategy, which is to sort of flaunt your weirdness in a different way.
Yeah. So there's different ways to approach this, and like not all of them are going to work for every single person. So like getting support is like the most obvious way, and that's a way that a lot of people dealt with it, is like they basically got a group to rally around them, whether it was their family or friends. But some other people would just like get really comfortable being like uncomfortable. Like so one woman that I interviewed, Ozma, who's this Muslim woman who grew up in a small southern town, she would sort of just be really proud to be different. Even though she was different from all the evangelical Christians she grew up around, she had this motto that was like, everywhere I am is a good time. Which like, so if she wasn't drinking or if she wasn't,
Mm.
participating in like Christmas parades or whatever else, like she was still confident in how different she was, which I thought was kind of cool. It definitely takes a lot of gusto to um, be that way.
Well, yeah, I was going to say, just like it's easy to understand that groups tend to look warily among at outsiders, I think that our first reaction is that it's hard being thought of as weird all the time, right? At being different, it's at the very least, it sounds exhausting, kind of psychically.
Yeah, and that's really like I did a Reddit IMA yesterday, and that's really what like came through, is that like a lot of folks actually, like I did not, so the book is not out yet, so the people have not read it, but
Mm.
the like a lot of people, a lot of trans people did like write in and say like, I feel different at work, like I'm worried about my career, how my career will be affected by being trans, like do you have any advice for trans people? So I do think that like even though we've grown more accepting as a society, thankfully, like a lot of folks still have to deal with the distress of like, how will my visible difference affect me? How will people see me differently once they realize like that I'm not exactly like them?
Yeah, and I presume that there's different personality types that deal better with this automatically, right? That the example you mentioned of the woman who enjoys being weird in different situations. Uh, Probably again, we all feel that way a little bit. We don't want to be exactly cookie cutter like everybody else, but it is just a path of lesser resistance to fit in with a wider group.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I mean, I think like there was like one thing I mentioned in my book is like there's like this optimal level of weirdness, right? So like
Hmm.
it's most people like to be not, 100% with the um in crowd, but also not like so different that it's like bizarre. So like if you think about indie music, it's like a really good example of this. Like indie music is like not that indie. It's like I think like the most popular genre of music. But people really like it because it like feels indie, right? Or like
Yeah.
it feels like you're not part of the mainstream rock, which is like completely gone away, and you're not part of like experimental electronica that is like totally non-melodic. And the same with like I think the largest group of voters is our independents. Which is like another good example of this, where like people are like, I'm not part of this group or that group. I'm part of this other group that is itself a group. Like,
Yeah.
so most of us like to be somewhere in the middle there between totally weird and totally in with a group.
I mean, I guess that's true. I was thinking about how exhausting and tiring it must be to not fit in, but at the same time, people really do like to feel that they're not just following the group. I did a podcast with Ezra Klein on political polarization, and he brings up the interesting fact that, like you say, a huge number of Americans on a survey will say they are independents. They do not belong to any political party. But when you ask how they actually vote, they are not swing voters. There's only a tiny fraction of these people that do not reliably vote either Republican or Democrat. They just like being members of that independent group.
Oh, totally. Yeah, that's like so intoxicating, right? To feel like we're special snowflakes and like we're different in some way, even though we all kind of end up doing the same thing.
So what do you think, is there advice to be given about what are good coping strategies if you find yourself in a slightly weird group? Should you move to a place where there are more people like you, or does the ability of online communities help people find like-minded folks to hang around with and assure themselves that they're not completely crazy?
Yeah, so I do talk about some people who moved from California to McKinney so that they could be around like-minded conservatives.
Hmm.
McKinney, Texas, sorry. And I thought that was a really interesting and extreme example of like if you really get um, sick of being an oddball, you can always just like go join your tribe wherever they are. But for the most part, I mean, one strategy that I really liked that I thought was kind of a low stakes kind of way to try this out is called idiosyncrasy credits. And it's this idea that like you can introduce weird ideas and like strange kind of thoughts and like concepts. You just have to kind of establish your normalcy first.
Right.
You have to kind of prove that you can fit in first. So the way to do this is like, let's say you start at a new job and you really want to introduce like a crazy idea for an event, right?
Hmm.
And the firm is like really buttoned up and you don't think that they'll buy it. So one way to do it is just to like kind of go to your first, I don't know, 10, 20 meetings and be like totally on board with everything, totally a yes man, like conform as best you can with like the low stakes stuff. And then for your big kind of ask, the one that really matters, that's where you can like break out your nonconformity and be super bring out your weird idea and kind of make your big unusual ask, and people will already feel like, well, he's so part of the group, he's so like in line with what we already want, and like he's one of us, so why shouldn't we consider this idea because it's being put forward by someone who we consider one of us and like a great cultural fit, as they say in the workplace. So like that's one way if you really have like just one big thing that you want to get across, is just to like kind of play the part a little bit beforehand.
Yeah, I really like this actually because as much as words like conformity and the establishment and so forth have a negative connotation, norms do serve a purpose, right? There are reasons why societies and social groups act in certain ways conventionally and not in others. And weirdness and nonconformity is also important, but this sort of mixed strategy, as a poker player would call it, of being, showing that you know what the rules are and understand them and respect them, but also occasionally want to break them, sounds like a healthy way of going through the situation.
Right. And I think this actually reminds me of something my friend Derek Thompson wrote a book as well, and one of his like big findings was like people like things that are sort of the same as everything else
Yeah.
except slightly different.
Yep.
So it's like a similar principle here where like you want to be hitting like 90% of like what everyone else is doing, but you want that 10% to be like your special flair
Mm-hmm.
that you
Mm-hmm.
bring to a situation. So that might be a good way to think about it, especially in places that really, where it really matters, like work.
Yeah, I'm sure that there's a physics way of thinking about this in terms of power laws and occasional deviations from
Yeah.
standard expectations, but we won't try to do that right now. Um, Good. So there's yeah. So there's the job of the weird people for their own good to survive and flourish and get through life. I guess we didn't go into the online possibilities. Like, are you a fan of not just moving from one place to another, but finding your like-minded, spiritual brethren online?
Yeah, I mean, I really don't do that. I don't spend a lot of time online with uh, other people. I don't know why that is. I just really prefer, like, if I'm going to hang out with people, I prefer to do it in person.
Hmm.
But I think a lot of people really do get a lot of solace from that and really enjoy online communities and like online, gaming and like things like that. I just personally can't speak to that because I don't do it, but obviously like that's a huge community. At that point though, I would question like whether you really feel different because um you obviously like are then part of a big community, and like some
Yeah.
people that community is bigger for them than like what's going on in their real life. So I would say like that's great, that's a great way of community building, but I would say that person probably is not struggling with some of the situations that I'm bringing up in my book.
Yeah, okay. I mean, and we also, so then the flip side of this is the individual who's a little bit weird, learning coping strategies, either finding like-minded souls or deploying their weirdness at strategic moments. The other side is the community making use of weirdness, right? Like you already mentioned creativity as something that might come out of being a little bit weird. Maybe say more about how those two things are related.
Yeah, I mean, there's like a pretty vast body of scientific research showing that as you add dissenting voices to a group, the group makes better decisions. There was like a famous a Solomon Asch study or variations on the Solomon Asch study that showed this, that essentially like the in order to make a good decision, you need people who don't all agree perfectly, because if you're all agreeing perfectly, you're too pointed in the direction that where you have like this inescapable momentum, and that's how you get things like Enron, or whatever
Yeah.
the other famous examples of groupthink are, where you have people who are just like getting carried away with drinking their own Kool-Aid.
Hmm.
um, but if you need those dissenting voices to kind of like you need the cooling saucer of the weirdo there to like to get everyone to consider other possibilities, because otherwise it's just like way too group thinky. And so yeah, so like societally, I mean, this is like a huge call for including diverse voices and diverse viewpoints in anything where there's like a broad consensus being formed. Definitely the media, but also other situations like policy making or business decision making. It's hugely important to have diverse perspectives in that situation, just because you want people to kind of be that kind of crucible of friction with you, so that you can make the best decision possible.
Well, it's certainly applicable to academia. I know where, in an area like theoretical physics, sometimes there's not a lot of data that you can rely on, and it's just a bunch of people and their ideas. And everyone probably would agree that it's good to have some outside the box ideas in the mix. But then when you're an actual department trying to hire somebody, are you going to hire the one outside the box person who is maybe going to revolutionize everything, but probably not going to do anything at all? Or are you going to hire a person who's working in the mainstream and likely to give some solid contributions? And the answer is almost always you're going to go for the person likely to give some solid contributions. It's just too much of a risk to get out there. And we end up being a little bit stodgier than we should be because of that.
Yeah, I think yeah, I've heard that. I'm not an academic, but I've heard that complaint about academia before. But you also have like to speak from my own
Hmm.
wheelhouse in the media. A lot of these big like when people do say that the media is too alarmist or that there's some big press um, uh, thing that the press blows out of proportion. A lot of that happens because people are kind of taking a cue from each other and no one's taking a second to be like, wait a minute, how much do we really know here? And are there other possibilities we could be um, thinking about? Because people don't want to be considered weird, right?
Yeah.
So, like, a good example of this is crack babies. The media in the 1980s did a bunch of reporting about the future crack babies of America and how, like, they're basically going to be mentally challenged and they're not going to be able to like keep up with society, and we've like completely doomed these babies to be um, like crack addled for life. And I'm not saying that crack is fine, but I'm saying that like those that didn't actually happen. Like
Yeah.
that those kids, like the level of cognitive disability was much lower than was predicted. And the idea that this whole generation of especially inner city African Americans was somehow doomed to be like vegetables was totally wrong. And I think that that's because like it bounced from like the New York Times, Time Magazine to Newsweek to
Hmm.
this and that, and like people just didn't take time to put the brakes on it, and that you see that happen a lot.
Yeah, yeah, and maybe a little bit of dissenting voices. I mean, it's interesting because it appears in many different contexts. I mean, you're talking about the psychology and the sociology of being a weird person in a group, but then there's just sort of the political science of having dissenting voices and the free market of ideas and stuff like that, and it goes to the same place. Are there benefits to being weird besides creativity? Like, I mean, can we give the sales pitch for why you should be proud of your weirdness a little bit?
Yeah, so the other big advantage that I really zero in on in the book is this tendency to really know and stick to your core principles really, really um, truthfully. Like to be really sure of what you want in life and what you're doing, and kind of like be more confident than most people are in that way. And I know that sounds a little vague, but to give you an idea, like some of the people that I was most impressed by were the people who were online dating back when that was considered really strange and like a good way to get axe
Hmm.
murdered. And like, like the way they talked about it, or they were like, it didn't matter what people said. I just loved this person. I thought what we were doing was cool. Like I was comfortable with it. I was happy to be, like this kind of weirdo who was like reading over my emails back before there was like email. It really, so like, and obviously, like, and they're still married, those couples, like, and they have this wonderful origin story that is like so unique and so cute. And of course, not everything you do is going to be like that, but I just thought it was a good example of how if you really believe in something, even if everyone thinks it's weird, it often helps you find your moral compass and stick to it if you're really committed to that decision.
I think that makes sense, and that's a really good point as we wrap up here. Because exactly because there's so much social pressure on you when you are deviating from the norm, when you sort of sit back and think, okay, should I be like this anyway, despite the fact that there's social pressure on me? It really does, in principle, I think it could help you figure out what's so important and what's maybe not so important.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it helps you kind of separate the wheat from the chaff of like your own inner man.
And it goes back to what you said about the idiosyncrasy credits that you have. Like, if you maybe you want to be weird in 100 different dimensions, but maybe it's worth sitting down and thinking about where is it worth it? Like,
Yeah.
what things should I just like go along with the flow because it's just not worth the struggle, and where what are the others where I'm really going to fight for my difference here?
Yeah, totally. I mean, this is why I recommend people just dress really boringly at the office because you want to save your chips for the fights with your boss about more important stuff.
I'm on your side there. All right. So for the last thing, I just wanted to ask, you start the book with your own experience of weirdness, right? You grew up an immigrant in a conservative Texas town and so forth. Has this study that you've done of all these different ways of being weird and so forth, has this changed how you think about your own variety of weirdness, which was kind of mostly external, right? It was things you were born into, not things you chose.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I guess so. I started to rethink whether I was really that different from people in my hometown. Like that maybe this
Mm.
feeling that I've had my whole life was more internal than more at least like internally perpetuated than externally perpetuated. Like I started to rethink whether my parents and I were really like as harshly looked down upon and judged as I kind of feared that we were. Yeah, that's kind of the main thing that I started to rethink. Yeah, is like my own weirdness, I guess.
No, I mean, actually, I think that's a fascinating thing that I didn't even think to talk about. We were sort of taking weirdness for granted as a thing, but not only is it subjective what counts as weird, but a little bit of judgment goes into thinking whether or not we actually are weird, and maybe we perceive ourselves as either weird or not weird in a way very different from what the society we're in is judging us to be.
Yeah, totally. I mean, your self perception is a huge part of things. And as someone like I have a lot of social anxiety, which like I think causes me to maybe overstate the negatives when it comes to like how different I am from people. And so I tried to like correct for that toward the end of the book.
Yeah, well, I think it's a good. I recommend the book absolutely to listeners out here. It's a good way of trying to tune ourselves to be just the right amount of weird, which is a good goal, but a tough thing to achieve.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, Olga Khazan, thanks so much for being on the Mindscape podcast.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me on. It was fun.